The house felt wrong the moment Emily left, not because anything was broken, but because everything was too quiet, and Daniel noticed it the second he stepped inside after work and saw her shoes missing by the door, the space where her keys always rested empty, and the kitchen light turned off when she always left it on, and then he saw the note on the counter, folded neatly, as if she had practiced leaving it there, and the words were simple, almost kind, saying she needed time, she needed space, she was sorry, but those words hit harder than anger ever could, because they gave him nothing to fight against, no clear reason, no argument, just absence, and Daniel stood there longer than he realized, holding the paper, replaying the past few months in his head at a fast, painful pace, missed dinners, quiet mornings, polite conversations that replaced laughter, moments he thought were normal but now felt like warnings he ignored, and he moved through the house slowly, noticing every small detail that now felt heavier, her favorite mug still in the sink, the photo frame slightly tilted on the shelf, the faint smell of her perfume in the hallway, and the silence followed him like a shadow, pressing on his chest, making it hard to breathe, yet he kept going, because stopping would mean facing how alone he suddenly was, and the days that followed moved quickly but felt endless, work blurred together, meals became something he rushed through, nights stretched long as he lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how love could fade without a loud ending, wondering if he failed without realizing it, and he avoided calling friends, avoided explaining, because he didn't know what to say beyond the fact that his wife had chosen to leave without telling him why, and then, just when he thought the quiet had settled into something permanent, the doorbell rang one gray afternoon, sharp and unexpected, cutting through the silence like a crack in glass, and Daniel hesitated before opening the door, not ready for company, not ready for questions, and when he did open it, the sight stopped him cold, because standing there was Margaret, Emily's mother, holding an umbrella dripping rainwater and a small bag that suggested she wasn't just visiting for an hour, and her face carried a mix of concern, tiredness, and something deeper that Daniel couldn't name, and she greeted him gently, not with shock or blame, but with a soft voice that asked if she could come in for a while, and Daniel stepped aside almost without thinking, because in that moment, the house no longer felt like it could hold its silence alone, and as Margaret walked inside, bringing the sound of rain and movement with her, Daniel sensed that this visit was not random, that it marked the end of one kind of loneliness and the beginning of something uncertain, something that would force him to face emotions he had been avoiding, and as the door closed behind her, the quiet didn't disappear, but it changed, and Daniel had no idea that this single moment would quietly begin to reshape his entire world. Margaret's presence changed the house faster than Daniel expected, not in loud or dramatic ways, but through small, steady moments that filled the empty spaces Emily left behind, and from the first evening she stayed, the house no longer felt frozen in time, because she moved through it with quiet purpose, unpacking her bag neatly, asking where to place her shoes, offering to make dinner even though Daniel insisted he wasn't hungry, and she cooked something simple, nothing fancy, yet the smell alone stirred something in him, reminding him that life still moved forward whether he was ready or not, and they ate together at the table without forcing conversation, without awkward questions, just sharing the space, and afterward Margaret washed the dishes calmly while Daniel dried them, their movements natural, almost familiar, which surprised him, because he hadn't realized how much he missed ordinary routines, and the days that followed settled into a rhythm, with Margaret waking early, making coffee, reading quietly near the window, and Daniel leaving for work with a strange sense of comfort he hadn't felt in weeks, knowing someone would be there when he returned, and in the evenings they talked more, not about Emily at first, but about life, work, small memories, and the world outside, and Margaret never pushed him to explain his pain, never asked questions that felt sharp. Instead she shared her own stories, about raising Emily alone after losing her husband, about learning how to be strong without becoming hard, about mistakes she made when she was younger and the lessons time forced her to learn, and Daniel listened closely, surprised by how open she was, by how honest her words felt, and as the days passed, the conversation slowly deepened, moving naturally toward topics that mattered, like loneliness, regret, hope, and the quiet fear of starting over, and one night, while sitting in the living room with the TV playing softly in the background, Margaret spoke about how love doesn't always end with anger, sometimes it ends with confusion, and that thought stayed with Daniel long after the words were spoken, because it described his marriage perfectly, and without realizing it, he began to look forward to their talks, to the calm way Margaret listened when he finally opened up about the night Emily left, about the note, about the way the silence had nearly swallowed him whole, and Margaret did not defend her daughter or criticize her, she only acknowledged his pain, telling him that his feelings were real and valid, and that simple acceptance eased something heavy inside him, and slowly, the house felt warmer, not because the hurt was gone, but because it was no longer hidden, and Daniel noticed changes in himself too, like how he laughed more easily, how he slept better, how the evenings no longer felt like something to survive, and yet, beneath the comfort, something else began to grow, something unspoken. Visible in the pauses between sentences, in the way their eyes met a second longer than needed, in the quiet understanding that passed between them without words, and Daniel tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just gratitude, just shared pain, just temporary closeness created by difficult circumstances, but the feeling did not fade, it strengthened, especially in moments when Margaret showed kindness without expecting anything in return, like folding his laundry when he worked late, or leaving a note reminding him to eat, or sitting nearby while he read, not speaking, simply present, and those moments made Daniel realize how deeply he had missed being seen, and still, he kept his distance emotionally, careful not to cross lines he didn't fully understand yet, because guilt lingered in the background, tied to the memory of Emily, tied to the idea of what was right versus what felt real, and Margaret seemed aware of this struggle, because she never stepped closer than necessary. Never touched him beyond brief, respectful gestures, never said anything that forced him to face what he wasn't ready to name, and yet the connection continued to grow quietly, filling the house with a sense of shared healing, and one evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows and they sat across from each other with warm cups of tea, Margaret spoke about how life sometimes brings people together not to replace what was lost, but to help them stand again, and Daniel felt those words settle deep in his chest, because he realized that her presence had done exactly that, helped him stand when he thought he would collapse, and as he looked around the room, at the soft light, the calm silence, and the woman who had unexpectedly become his anchor, Daniel understood that something important was happening, something fragile and powerful at the same time, and though he didn't know where it would lead, he knew one thing clearly: the quiet connection forming between them was no longer something he could ignore, and the house that once felt empty was now holding a new kind of emotional weight, one that carried both comfort and uncertainty, and as Daniel sat there listening to Margaret's steady voice, he sensed that his life was slowly shifting again, moving toward a place he never imagined, and he could feel that whatever came next would test his heart in ways he was not yet prepared for. The shift Daniel tried to ignore became impossible to escape the night the storm arrived, loud and sudden, cutting the sky open with heavy rain and sharp wind, and when the power went out without warning, the house fell into darkness so complete it felt like the early days after Emily left all over again, except this time he was not alone, and Margaret moved calmly, finding candles, lighting them one by one, their soft glow filling the room with shadows that made everything feel closer, more real, and they sat across from each other in the living room, the storm raging outside while the world inside grew strangely quiet, and without television noise or lamps or distractions, every word mattered more, every pause carried weight, and Margaret spoke about fear, about how loneliness can trick people into thinking they are broken when they are only wounded, and Daniel listened, feeling each sentence land deep inside him, because it described exactly how he had felt since Emily walked away, and for the first time he admitted out loud that he felt abandoned, not just by his wife, but by the future he thought was certain, and Margaret did not rush to comfort him with empty words. She simply listened, her attention steady, her presence grounding, and that made him speak more honestly than he had with anyone before, about how he blamed himself, how he wondered if he was too quiet, too predictable, too safe to be loved for long, and Margaret told him gently that love does not fail because of kindness or stability, it fails when people stop understanding themselves, and that truth hit him harder than anger ever could, and as the storm continued, Daniel noticed how close they sat, not touching, but near enough to feel warmth, and that closeness stirred something unfamiliar yet comforting, and he hated himself for noticing it, hated the guilt that followed, yet could not deny how alive he felt in that moment, and when Margaret spoke again, her voice softer now, she said that some connections come into our lives during broken seasons not to confuse us, but to remind us that our hearts still work, and Daniel stood suddenly, overwhelmed, pacing near the window, watching rain blur the world outside, trying to steady his thoughts, because he felt pulled in two directions, toward the past that still held his name and toward a future he never planned for, and Margaret sensed his struggle and spoke carefully, telling him she never wanted to be the cause of pain or regret, that she valued honesty more than comfort, and that if her presence became too much, she would leave without question. And those words stopped him, because the thought of her leaving tightened his chest in a way he could not ignore, and before he could respond, the lights flickered back on, ending the darkness, breaking the moment, and almost immediately Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket, the sound sharp in the quiet room, and when he looked at the screen and saw Emily's name, his heart dropped, his hands trembling as he read the short message saying she needed to talk, that she was coming back soon, and suddenly everything felt unstable again, because the past was no longer distant, it was approaching fast, and Margaret noticed the change in his expression and understood without asking, her face calm but guarded, and the rest of the night passed quietly, the storm fading, the candles blown out, both of them retreating into their thoughts, and the following days moved quickly, filled with tension Daniel could not shake, because Emily's return hung over him like an approaching deadline, forcing him to examine feelings he never planned to face, and he watched Margaret closely, noticing how she grew more distant without becoming cold, giving him space. Respecting boundaries he didn't even know how to define, and that restraint made his feelings clearer, not weaker, and one afternoon, while they stood in the kitchen making coffee, their hands briefly brushed, innocent, accidental, but the moment lingered longer than it should have, and both stepped back at the same time, exchanging a look filled with understanding and restraint, and nothing was said, because words would have crossed lines neither of them was ready to step over, and Daniel realized then that what he felt was not confusion or gratitude or loneliness alone, it was connection built on shared honesty and emotional safety, something he hadn't felt in his marriage for a long time, and that realization scared him, because it meant that whatever choice he made next would change lives. And when Emily finally called to confirm her arrival, Daniel's voice was steady but his heart was not. And after the call ended, he sat alone, staring at the wall, realizing that love was no longer a simple idea, but a responsibility that demanded truth, and as Margaret quietly packed a few things in her room, preparing for the change that was coming, Daniel understood that the hardest part was not choosing between two people, but choosing who he was becoming, and with Emily's return now certain, and his feelings no longer hidden, Daniel knew that the next step would force him to face himself completely, and whatever decision followed would redefine love for him forever. Emily arrived on a quiet morning, not dramatic, not rushed, just standing at the door with tired eyes and a careful smile, and Daniel noticed immediately how different everything felt, because the fear he once had of losing her was gone, replaced by a calm awareness that something inside him had already moved on, and they sat in the living room where so much silence had lived before, and Emily spoke quickly, explaining how she felt lost, how she needed to escape, how leaving felt easier than facing her doubts, and Daniel listened without anger, without interruption, because he understood her words even if they came too late, and when she asked if they could start again, if they could try to rebuild what was broken, Daniel felt the weight of that question settle on him, but instead of panic, he felt clarity, and he answered honestly, telling her that love could not grow where fear still ruled, that he had changed during her absence, and that returning to what they were would only repeat the same ending, and Emily cried softly, not out of shock, but out of understanding, because deep down she knew the truth too, and they parted respectfully, with kindness instead of blame, and when the door closed behind her, Daniel felt sadness, but not regret, and later that day he found Margaret in the guest room folding her clothes, preparing to leave quietly, as she always did, and she told him she never intended to stay once Emily returned, that her role was never to replace anyone, only to offer support when it was needed most, and Daniel thanked her, his voice steady but full, telling her that she had saved him in ways she might never fully understand, and they stood there facing each other, the air filled with things unsaid, and for the first time, Daniel spoke clearly about his feelings, not in dramatic words, but in simple truth, saying that she helped him see himself again, that her presence reminded him what emotional safety felt like, and Margaret listened carefully. Her expression calm but moved, and she admitted that she felt the connection too, but that she believed timing and intention mattered more than desire, and that neither of them deserved a love born from confusion or guilt, and Daniel respected that, because it matched what his heart already knew. And when Margaret left later that afternoon, walking down the driveway with quiet grace, Daniel did not chase after her, because he understood that some bonds do not need immediate answers to be real. And as the house returned to silence once more, it no longer felt empty, it felt settled, like a chapter closing properly at last. And in the weeks that followed, Daniel rebuilt his life with intention, reconnecting with friends, rediscovering interests he had set aside, learning how to be alone without feeling abandoned, and during that time, he and Margaret stayed in touch through thoughtful messages and occasional calls, never rushing, never crossing lines, allowing space for healing to do its work. And months later, when they met again over coffee in a small cafe, there was no tension, only warmth, honesty, and a shared understanding that they had both grown stronger on their own. And this time, when they talked, it was not about pain or loss, but about hopes, values, and the kind of future they wanted to build slowly and openly. And Daniel realized then that love did not always arrive in the way stories promised. Sometimes it came quietly after heartbreak, asking for patience instead of passion, clarity instead of chaos. And as they walked out together into the evening light, Daniel felt grounded, not swept away, but certain, knowing that his world had changed not because he was abandoned, but because he finally learned what love should feel like. And for the first time, the future did not scare him, it invited him forward.